Hey everyone, good afternoon and welcome to our Halk TV program on Hagia Sophia. On Thursday last week, a Turkish court heard a case aimed at converting the Hagia Sophia back into a mosque, but it postponed its decision and will announce its verdict in a couple of weeks. President Erdogan's calls to change the status of Hagia Sophia have drawn an international response from faith leaders, religious freedom watchdogs like the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, and governments around the world who all call on this UNESCO World Heritage Site to be preserved as a museum. Now today, Tuğba Tanyeri-Erdemir, a research associate at the University of Pittsburgh Department of Anthropology with an extensive background in the study of cultural heritage sites, joins us to discuss what's at stake for the Hagia Sophia, Erdogan's motives, and what we should expect in the next weeks. Tuğba, welcome to this segment on Halk TV.
Thank you so much for having me.
So before we get into Erdogan's motives, I want to talk about last week's court decision first and kind of if you can lay the groundwork for us and see, frame it for our listeners. Over a week ago, we recorded a podcast episode together where you warned that this case would be pivotal for the future of Hagia Sophia. And you stated specifically that you were very concerned about this decision on the podcast. And now on Thursday last week, the court decided to push back this decision a couple of weeks. What do you make of this delay, and do you think there's a chance it will maintain the status of Hagia Sophia as a museum?
My concern on Hagia Sophia's status still continues. The court is deliberating at the moment, and where I see it, the ball appears to be at Erdogan's court at the moment. So it can go either way, but we will have to wait for the court's decision. So the case was brought to the Turkish courts in about 2005. So it had been ongoing for a couple of years in different forms by a private foundation that is not related to Erdogan. But the verdict date was given as July the 2nd, which fit very well with Erdogan's contemporary discourse. And we're still waiting for the verdict to come out.
So we discussed this on the podcast as well. So whoever hasn't heard it, I recommend that you head over to the Greek Current and check out our daily podcast where we highlight all the breaking news every day. And Tuğba was one of our guests a couple of weeks ago when we discussed this specific issue. So it's a great primer and a great place that you can get some really good background on what is going on with Hagia Sophia. But on that podcast, Tuğba, we talked about an article that you published last week or the week before where you wrote that Erdogan's most recent calls within the last 2 years to turn Hagia Sophia into a mosque were either ploys to gain political ground or divert public attention away from his political failures. Now his latest push, however, may be different. Can you explain why?
I think Erdogan is at a moment in his political career where he is within Turkey facing a lot of challenges. The economic downturn, for instance, is a big issue for Erdogan. So Hagia Sophia might be in the public eye to cover up some of his failures domestically. But at the same time, we should not underestimate the fact that Erdogan is a long-time strategist. And this may also be a time that he has planned out for a long time, that he wants to put Hagia Sophia as his legacy project on the map. So both of these scenarios are actually causes for concern for Hagia Sophia's future, I think.
Can you talk a little bit about the challenges that Erdogan is facing on the political front and the economic front?
His votes are going down. The Turkish economy has taken a turn for the worse, and it's going much worse with the ongoing pandemic crisis. His popularity seems to be decreasing. So these are the issues that are facing him within Turkey at the moment.
And in your piece, it was evident that this move is trying to fire up his base, and the base leans Islamist and the ultra-national base in Turkey. What's the wider perspective on this issue in Turkey? Do you see the Turkish population reacting to his calls around Hagia Sophia in the way that he wants?
or does it have broad support, or is it simply limited to those two segments of Turkish society?
We have to think about two different issues. One of them is the fact that there is some support in Turkish society, not widespread, within the Islamists and ultranationalists for Hagia Sophia to be reopened as a functioning mosque. This has been an ongoing, steady thing throughout Turkish Republican history. At the moment, Erdogan is using this discourse to gain more popularity within his own AKP voting base. To a certain extent, there is, at the moment, support for Hagia Sophia's status to change. But to give you one example on why we're not hearing the voices that are against Hagia Sophia's transformation within Turkey, is something I lived through the last week. Last week, we penned and circulated a letter written by a group of academics, scholars working Ottoman and Byzantine history on why we don't think this move to reconvert Hagia Sophia is a good idea, and why we think keeping its status as a museum is very important for the long-term survival of the monument. Now, my name, along with 10 other Turkish academics, were picked from that list and was published on a Turkish Islamist newspaper, Yeni Akit. So this has grave consequences for anybody who is on this list. I mean, of course, I live in America, so my status is not as dire as my Turkish colleagues, but this is basically a list of people that will be circulated. It can affect their promotion, it can affect their future funding, it can cause an assault for them. So in Turkey, if you have any opposition to Erdogan, you risk a lot in your personal and professional life by speaking out. So to a certain extent, why we are not hearing very clear voices within Turkey for not opening Hagia Sophia as a functioning mosque is the limits that are posed on the population at large by Erdogan.
And it takes incredible bravery, like you just described, to put your name on a list, especially if you're living in Turkey at the moment. So
Absolutely.
We want to thank all of those brave individuals who did add their names because this is an important issue. And that brings me to my next question, and that's, besides the list that you added your name to and the piece, there's another piece that you wrote with the Commissioner of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom last week, Reverend Johnny Moore, where you argue that the conversion of Hagia Sophia to a mosque will endanger the future of the World Heritage Site. Given your background, extensive background, I would say, in the study of cultural heritage sites, what are your concerns specifically when it comes to the future of Hagia Sophia should Erdogan ultimately change his status? What will change for the site as, you know, this World Heritage Site that UNESCO has designated?
Let's think about former examples. In the past, Erdogan's government have decided to open Hagia Sophias of Nicaea and Trabzon for Islamic worship, which had been serving as museums for decades previously. So after this transition, both of the edifices suffered greatly, precisely because of the lack of personnel who takes care of these buildings on a daily basis. Trained professionals who are designated to take care of these places are not there anymore. So it is actually not necessarily, the danger does not come necessarily from a change in function, but rather a change in stewardship and jurisdiction within the Turkish system of heritage protection, that by opening these monuments as functioning mosques, you take them away from the Ministry of Culture and put them underneath the General Directorate of Pious Foundations. So from a structural point of view, this causes a lot of problems. But also think about all of the different layers of decisions that need to be taken once a monument like, for instance, the Hagia Sophia of Trabzon was turned into a functioning mosque. They practically built like a little tent within the building so that the frescoes were not seen anymore. So think about all of these decisions, how they apply to Hagia Sophia, and how much more conflict will those decisions put on Hagia Sophia. To preserve a monument like Hagia Sophia that embodies a very long history with different layers in its entirety for the world, museum, keeping it as a museum gives us the opportunity to take care of it in the way that it needs to be.
Yeah, and obviously it's built in the 5th century, so there is an archaeological element to it as well, where you want it to be taken care of in a specific way. Now, you talked a little bit about Hagia Sophia and Trabzon, and you talked a little bit about some other sites, but what in general is the position of cultural sites that were affiliated with other minority religions within Turkey? What's their status today? Do they face a similar, I don't want to say a similar threat that Hagia Sophia faces in their preservation?
There are multiple problems for sites of minority heritage in Turkey. Let's think a little bit back in Turkish history. Think about the Armenian genocide of 1915 and the population exchange between Turkey and Greece in 1924. Both of these events made Christianity almost disappear from Anatolia. And at the moment, there are thousands and thousands of churches, monasteries, cemeteries, religious schools, orphanages across Turkey that are left without their primary constituencies. So in such a case, it is within the Turkish government's responsibility to take care of all of its cultural heritage, including its, minority cultural heritage. However, this has not been done. Apart from the iconic PR projects in Akdamar, Sümele Monastery, and recently the Iron Church in Istanbul, very little attention has been given to the minority of other minority heritage of other religions than Sunni Islam. One example that comes to my mind, for instance, is the case of Principio Greek Orthodox Orphanage, which is an amazing wooden building that requires very meticulous preservation practices. And the Turkish government had the control of the building for decades, did not do anything in terms of conservation or preservation. And when, after a very lengthy legal battle, the ownership of the orphanage was given back to the Orthodox community, now the Greek Orthodox community in Turkey is faced with the decision to raise funds to, restore this precious monument. So this is actually a very important kind of event that highlights the inequality in how heritage is funded and restored and preserved within Turkey. So Hagia Sophia is one example, but there are multiple other cases that really needs more attention, both from the Turkish government, but also from the international community as well.
Do you think, you mentioned an interesting case where ownership was returned to the community? Is that something that we're seeing happen in Turkey on a broader scale at all, or is the government maintaining its control over a number of the sites?
We're not seeing this at a large scale. There are certainly demands from different religious minority groups to take control of their heritage in different parts. But the Turkish government by no means makes it easy for the communities to take back their heritage.
And I want to welcome everybody as well who's watching to submit your questions. If you post them in the comments, we'll try and get to them. And we've just seen our first question pop up from Andy Zemenidis, who asks that we've seen a few statements on Hagia Sophia from prominent American policymakers, most notably Secretary of State Pompeo, Ambassador Brownback, and the former Undersecretary of State, Tony Blinken. Do you believe that these statements were strong enough, and how will Erdogan interpret these statements?
I think these statements were very balanced and well worded. They were strong enough in the way that it captures Erdogan's attention in terms of where the international community, where the United States stands on this matter, but they were also carefully worded so that they do not cross the boundary of the issue of national sovereignty that Erdogan and his ministers have voiced multiple times. And I think this is a positive thing that both Pompeo's statement, Sam Brownback's statement, and the USCIRF statement, they all have the common aim of preserving the monument for everybody in its entirety. So I think they were really well formulated statements.
And aside from these statements, that we saw also statements from USCIRF. We saw Greece and Greece take action with UNESCO. And France also issued a statement as well. And like you said, Erdogan responded with this is a national sovereignty issue, trying to brush it off. But what do you make of the action that Greece took vis-a-vis UNESCO? Do you think UNESCO has more of a role to play in this?
We wish. There are multiple problems with UNESCO. It's not necessarily only with Turkey, but if you think about it, UNESCO is an international body, and monuments are represented under UNESCO with the nations that they are located in. And if you're thinking about any cultural heritage, piece of cultural heritage that has a globally dispersed community, this of course creates multiple problems. UNESCO has not been vocal about the case of the Cora Museum either. So I'm not sure whether they will respond on Hagia Sophia. It would be certainly nice if they did, but sometimes UNESCO does not necessarily respond in the way that we think they should for the preservation of monuments and heritage.
Tuğba, faith leaders in Turkey have also spoken up, and we saw Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew remind the world that Hagia Sophia in its current status can, to quote him, function as a place and symbol of dialogue and peaceful coexistence between Christianity and Islam. What effect does the debate on Hagia Sophia have on Turkey's minority, on the Turkish minorities and their cultural not only their cultural heritage, but their day-to-day?
Yes. First of all, I'd like to thank the Ecumenical Patriarch for his, again, very well-worded statements, for focusing on the protection of the monument for all of us and keeping it as a bridge of understanding and coexistence. So I think the sense of his statement is very important for all of us to remember. One thing that I feel very concerned about, and I know the minority communities within Turkey are also very concerned about, is the fact that the whole Hagia Sophia discourse is framed around the idea of conquest. Still, within the Turkish government, people are using the word, it's won by the sword. And if you were living in Turkey as a Christian, as a Jew, as anybody other than Sunni Muslim, this would be a very threatening environment, actually. The more you talk about conquest, the more you talk about taking over religious heritage, taking over heritage by the sword, this creates an environment in which the minorities are not necessarily seen as equal citizens, but subjects dominated by the government. So, and this is something, whether minority or not, every Turkish citizen should be very concerned about. If we are a modern nation state with equal citizens, let's keep that up in the government discourse as well.
In your piece with Reverend Moore, the commissioner from USCIRF, you talked about this decision setting a precedent for vulnerable faith communities and their heritage in the broader Middle East. Can you put the decision on Hagia Sophia in that context for us?
Of course. The Middle East is going through a period in which the minority communities are under increasing risk every day. And when we are bringing back the discourse of conquest, how we will take over monuments, how we will reconquer them and make them into a mosque again, what sort of an example is that setting for the Middle East and larger world as well? So any power within the Middle East or elsewhere can use this as a model when they want to dominate others under their community. So I think it would be it would set a dangerous precedent in emboldening extremism.
Mm-hmm. We have another question that came in from the comments. I think you answered one of them, which went back to the motives behind the conversion and the celebration of this conquest that we got. But another question that we have from Evangelos Karabelas, he asked that would Magnitsky Act sanctions be appropriate if a conversion does occur, and if not, what policy options do you think exist to enforce the maintaining Hagia Sophia as a museum if UNESCO decides that this is a World Heritage Site that can't be changed?
Let's keep UNESCO out of the equation first. I think sanctions are a great policy tool for the United States government to impose on Turkey on different areas. For the conversion of Hagia Sophia, however, I don't exactly know how this would play out. It is certainly good to have those tools for the United States government, but I'm not so sure if that would be applicable for this case in particular. For the cases related to suppressing religious freedom within Turkey, absolutely. And if we can pinpoint people who commit crimes in that area, absolutely yes. But with the case of Hagia Sophia, this would be a challenging way to frame.
So your piece, obviously, we've pushed it out, and it got a pretty good reaction from our followers. But overall, this is another question that we received from Lori Champus now. Why isn't the American media more vocal on what's happening either with Hagia Sophia and specifically, as Lori asks, what's happening to democracy in Turkey? Today, the Washington Post Press Freedom Partnership highlighted the most pressing cases of journalists under attack, but failed to highlight a single Turkish journalist. And Turkey is the number 2 jailer, according to the latest statistics. So I'd love to get your take on that question.
I absolutely agree that issues related to the deterioration of democracy, free speech, media in Turkey is not finding enough outlets within the United States media. Hagia Sophia received somewhat more interest because of the iconic importance and symbolic meaning of the monument worldwide. But I'm absolutely on the same page with you on the subject that Turkey needs a lot more critical coverage in the United States press. And had Turkey received a lot more critical coverage over the last decade, maybe we would not be talking about Hagia Sophia's conversion at this moment, that Erdogan is at a point in his career that he can talk about these things too. So had there been more control over Erdogan's actions rather than appeasing, we may have been at a different state today.
Do you see, we've talked about the United States, but obviously one of Turkey's biggest partners is the European Union. Is there anything in that relationship that could push Erdogan and the current Turkish government into a direction, specifically on Hagia Sophia?
Any international push at this moment is very much welcome. Erdogan, in his domestic rhetoric, he behaves as if he doesn't care about what the world thinks of him. I do not believe so. I think he still has a lot more care in terms of what the European Union thinks of him, what the United States think of him, and also what Russia thinks of him and his actions. So this is the time that I would welcome any leader across the world to voice their opinions on the subject. And for instance, Moscow came out strong on Hagia Sophia, what it means to Greek Orthodoxy, and that it should be kept as a museum to preserve that heritage. So any push from the international community is very important and crucial, I believe.
You just mentioned Russia, and I wanted to ask about that as well. For our listeners, yesterday the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church of Russia, said that converting the Hagia Sophia from a museum to a mosque would be, quote, unacceptable. Given the close relationship, though, that exists between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Kremlin, and given Erdogan's dealings with Russia, do you think that this statement might carry more weight than some other ones and might influence Erdogan in a different way?
This is a good question. I was thinking more on from the statement that came from the Russian Foreign Ministry, and that also very clearly showed Russia's stance on this issue. And of course, Turkey and Russia has a very interesting recent history. They are sometimes they're friends, sometimes they're enemies, sometimes they're frenemies in different contexts across the world when international politics is concerned. But also on this issue, it's important to have Russia's statement. So I think it's important to have.
What should we be expecting? We mentioned that this court is going to decide in the next couple of weeks. Maybe they said in the next 15 days, and that was on Thursday last week. What should we expect from the court? And if it passes a decision, what would happen to the status? Would that simply throw the ball into Erdogan's court, and then he could decide if he wants to do it or not? Or would it be something that once the decision comes out, then this is it, and it's going to return to its status as a mosque?
So if there are two options, or three options rather, the court can decide that it is legitimate and legal to open Hagia Sophia as a mosque. The second option is that the court can say this, and I think this is where I see the court is going, this issue is beyond the limits of this particular court, the Turkish Council of State, but rather should be decided by the Council of Ministers and the President. Or the third option that they have done in the past, that this does not carry any legal weight, and we are denying this case. So I don't think it will be the third option in this part in history. If it's the first option, we have the precedent case of Kora, where the site is still serving as a museum. So no steps that we have seen out in the open have been taken to reconvert Kora back into a mosque. But in the third option, it would be completely up to Erdogan to come up with a strategy to explore it. He may again call in the Council of Ministers to rediscuss the issue. He may give the decision himself. The one advantage of that kind of second option is the fact that again, I mentioned it in the beginning of this interview. The law case brought to court by a private association, not related to Erdogan. An Islamist one that may share some of the values that Erdogan has, but it is not organically related to with the AK Party or Erdogan himself. So Erdogan might also want the agency to be on him when the decision is being given. So this is again a hunch that I have that the second option might be the best for Erdogan's purposes. But then again, the jury is still out on this one, so we'll see.
And if I know you just laid out the options for us and told us that your preference is the second option, but
not my preference, my hunch.
Your hunch, sorry, that your hunch is the second option.
The third one.
But how do you see that? That's in the immediate term, right? That's in the next 2 weeks, in the next month, perhaps. Where do you see this going over the next year? Or is this going to be a recurring issue that comes up in political discourse in Turkey until the next presidential election?
This is a very good question. And I think I agree with you. Any decision that comes out of the court will continue to be debated until the next election. So Erdogan can still capitalize on the symbolic and political value of Hagia Sophia for his own political gain. So I do not think that the day after the court decision, Hagia Sophia will be opened as a mosque, but rather it will be something that Erdogan will use as something to keep his political ambition.
And keep his base interested and active on this issue, keep them fired up. What's the take? We saw in last year in the mayoral election in Istanbul, a member of the opposition who defeated Erdogan's handpicked candidate twice, even though Erdogan raised this issue of Hagia Sophia in the election, and had a bunch of comments about his about the current mayor of Istanbul now, calling him Greek or Armenian and various things that he thought would bring him down in his race. What is the rhetoric from people like Ekrem İmamoğlu or the opposition?
I actually was very pleased with Ekrem İmamoğlu's position. Again, he's the mayor of Istanbul. Hagia Sophia is part of his city. He was very clear on his position that he wanted to keep the monument as a museum, preserving all of its layers. But at the same time, and this is a purchase that I really enjoyed, he purchased a portrait of Fatih Sultan Mehmet, a 15th century portrait of Fatih Sultan Mehmet at an auction and brought it back to Istanbul. So on the one hand, he is acknowledging the historical importance of Mehmet II. On the other, he's very clear on his issue, on his stance on Hagia Sophia, keeping it as a museum. And I think this is a win-win situation. That, why shouldn't a very important work of art that is important to a large group of Turkish population should not be brought to Turkey. Why can't we keep that memory with that heritage and that artwork? At the same time, why don't we preserve Hagia Sophia with all of its layers as a museum? So I thought his approach to that was very good, and I commend him on that too. So.
And I want to, unless anyone else jumps in with questions in our comments in the next couple of minutes, I want to wrap up with a last question for you. And it's about, I want to return us back to cultural heritage and the preservation of cultural heritage. Obviously, in Hagia Sophia, there's been a lot of work that was done over the years to restore some of the mosaics and to really show that multi-layered cultural legacy that exists in the church. In the former cathedral, then became a mosque, and now a museum. So can you tell us about some of this work to preserve these amazing pieces of art that exist in Hagia Sophia? And what would it mean for Hagia Sophia if this change happened when we look at that art? How would it change? Would work stop on preserving it? What would happen?
First of all, let me start by thanking all the professionals, people who work on restoration, preservation. They have a very hard job. It's a very meticulous job. And, literally they work inch by inch on every single mosaic, every single floor piece, documenting almost every day whether or not the monument has shifted, whether the humidity levels is different than 2 weeks ago, and how they can figure out ways to preserve the monument while at the same time not limiting the visitor experience. And this is a much larger project than one does see as we enter into the building. I mean, every once in a while you will see a scaffolding somewhere. Every once in a while you will see some people working on one corner of the building. But it takes multiple international teams with different areas of expertise, all kind of brought together and work under the museum staff. So it is a daily, very meticulous, very hard work that they're doing. One of my worries is that work may get halted if and when a decision comes out of the court. And then we may not be monitoring the monument as closely as it is being done at the moment. And then, of course, we have to think about the issues of what is going to happen to the figural imagery, but also what is going to happen to the beautiful marble floor that gives a lot of the effects to the building. What will happen to the general structure once and if there is mass prayers within the building, in terms of humidity, in terms of its overall security and safety. So those are the issues that we will have to think about. But let me take this opportunity to thank everyone throughout the history of the building who have done their job to preserve the building so it made it to our day. Let's keep up the good work so it will be there for all of our kids to see, or grandkids and everybody else.
And I want to echo that sentiment. Tuğba, thank you so much for joining HALC TV to talk about this issue. For our viewers, this video will remain available on our Facebook page, so you can head to our page anytime and view the entire interview. Additionally, we're going to upload it onto YouTube, so you can head to our YouTube channel and view all of our programs that we've done with through HALC TV over the last months. Tuğba, thanks again for joining us. It's been great having you.
Thank you so much for having me.